This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
For millions, it must have seemed like a dream. Who were these conquerors from New York that had dealt Goliath such a blow? Were they dreamers? Not really. Just a football team. This is their story.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to open today's welcoming ceremonies for our conquering team. And it is a privilege, on behalf of the greatest city in the world, to pay tribute to the greatest football team in the world, the New York Jets.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Football Odyssey. I'm your host, Aron Harris, and today I'm speaking with Bob Lederer, the author of Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl team that changed football. In this episode, Bob and I discuss his book that looks at the various unheralded players on the 1968 New York Jets football team that shocked the world with their 16-7 victory over the vaunted Baltimore Colts of the National Football League in Super Bowl III that all but legitimized the American Football League and the forthcoming merger between the two rival leagues. If you're a football fan, a Jets fan, or simply a sports history fan, this is a book you had to have on your bookshelf. So if you'd like a copy, I've attached a link to Bob's book in the description. As always, feel free to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think of our conversation. That said, thank you for listening, and here is Bob Lederer. All right, Bob Lederer, thank you for joining us tonight, sir. How are you this evening?
Aaron, thank you for inviting me. It's one of my favorite subjects, obviously.
Of course. So going into this interview, I rewatched Super Bowl III, and it's probably my third or fourth time watching it.
Commercials and all?
No, commercials were edited out. That would have been the true fan, right?
Yeah.
But as I finished watching it, I began to wonder, how many times do you think you've seen it at this point?
I watched it probably first to last play a dozen times, maybe more. For the book, I probably did it, the bulk of those 12 times, maybe 9 or 10 of them.
Was there always something different that stood out to you every time you watched it?
It just kind of reminded me it was a rather dull game. It was not a scintillating game like we saw on Sunday, although the defense has dominated so much that, in the Rams and Bengals game, it certainly wasn't like, the game last year with Tampa or some of the really good, the St. Louis, Tennessee game, the Giants beating the Patriots when the Patriots were undefeated. It was a rather ho-hum affair, except that, holy cow, the Jets are winning. And they're winning by more, and they're winning by more. And what's going on? And here comes Unitas. That was probably the most fearsome part of that game when Unitas came in.
See, for me, every time I watch it, I actually enjoy it more and more because it is a different brand of football, especially in terms of the formations and the schemes. But being able to watch some of these players really stand out, like Matt Snell or Johnny Sample, like you have guys that are just very intelligent players, very hard runners. Because I think sometimes you could look back at some of the old players and underestimate their talents, but by today's standards, but they are really as every bit as talented, I think, as you could make the comparison to today.
I think the players are more talented today, but I'll tell you what I saw on Sunday in the Ram-Bengal game. Mm-hmm. George Sauer was Cooper Kupp before there was Cooper Kupp. And it didn't really show it in that game necessarily, but I could show you a couple of plays in super slow that would amaze you. But the Jets had a defensive lineman named John Elliott, who was their defensive right tackle. And he was Aaron Donald. He was so quick. As I point out in the book, guys who outweighed him by 50 pounds said to me, they couldn't get a clear shot at him. I went, what do you mean? He was so quick. Defensive tackle on the offensive tackle on the Kansas City Chiefs, who's in the Hall of Fame, said to me, I tried to hit John Elliott in the numbers to knock him out of the way. And I couldn't get a clean hit. I would glance off his shoulder because that's the way he was. And he did the same thing John Elliott did that in the second half Aaron Donald did. And that is they placed him either right over the center or just to the side of the center to create a situation where he was not going to get double teamed. Or if he did get double teamed, the guys next to him were prepared to take advantage of that double team. So I learned a lot from talking to Jets players in the book and after the book was published. And I see things in the games like I've just pointed out to you.
Yeah, and having a defensive tackle over the center was an AFL trademark in pro football.
And the Jets really were the first to do it. And chances are that Wade Eubank, who was the coach of the Jets and who was part of the Paul Brown tree, probably learned that from Paul Brown.
Right.
But yeah, that was one of the first things that the Jets did.
I've heard you mention that when you were young, you always enjoyed the other players aside from Namath, more so than Namath, I should say. So do you kind of look at this book now and think that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy that you would write this book for the world to read?
It's something I always wanted to do, but it wasn't for the reason that I ultimately did write this book, which was to give the long overdue credit to the, as I call it, 44 other guys who didn't have the name Namath on the back of their uniform, and who I also, strongly emphasize now, elevated Joe into celebrity status that is now listed for 53 years. Now, Joe Namath was a star before that game, but if Joe Namath had not won that game, he would not be in the Hall of Fame, and he would not be as memorable as he is now. So I wasn't destined to write the book, but as I explained in the book, it was my boys who sat down and watched one of the 12 times I saw the game. And they asked me questions like, who's this 75 and who's that 81? And I would point out to them who they were and what their numbers were and what their achievements were, and all pro 5 times, this guy was my favorite player, that sort of thing. So, and the thing was, we only heard in the papers from Sonny Werblin, the owner, great publicity hound, Weeb Eubank, the coach, for obvious reasons, and Joe. Once in a while you heard Matt Snell, once in a while you heard Don Maynard, but most of the time you didn't. And so they became even more curious to me as who are these guys and what are they like? And that made meeting them in some cases, or in most cases on the phone, but later I went to the 50th anniversary celebration and I got to meet these guys face to face, which I had not done during, the book process.
Now, you're from New York originally?
I was born and bred in Flushing, New York. I lived in 2 different areas within Flushing. One was, I looked this up, 2.3 miles from Shea Stadium, where the Jets played. And the other location was like 3.1 miles from Shea Stadium. But I was an easy bus ride and walk across the Roosevelt Avenue Bridge, which connected Main Street Flushing with Shea Stadium. And I did that over and over, although I only went to 1 Jets game at Shea Stadium in my life.
Which game was it?
I saw them lose to Kansas City the year before they went to the Super Bowl. This is This is the year that Kansas City had come off their Super Bowl defeat, but they were still a really an awesome team.
Yeah.
And I saw the Jets. I was freezing my you-know-what off at the next to last row in Shea Stadium, way up in the bleeding seats, and saw them lose. Ironically, I think they lost 16-7.
Now, were you a Giants fan that converted to a Jets fan for whatever reason, or were the Jets kind of your introduction to football?
Root for the Giants?
I
retract that question. No, the first football game I ever watched on TV was the Giants-Bears championship game in 1963. I just happened to turn it on.
Mm-hmm.
I got interested in the Jets because I was a Mets fan in 1963. I discovered baseball. I was 11 years old. And when the baseball season ended, and I remember it distinctly, I was in my grandmother's apartment, and the baseball season was over, and it was a Saturday night, and I turned on the radio, and I turned on the station that carried the Mets games, and lo and behold, the Jets were on WHN 1050 New York. And in fact, the Mets announcer, Bob Murphy, was doing the play-by-play. And I said, well, this is interesting. I didn't know anything about football.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that I was going to be, I was going to pay attention to the Jets. And I did. And I watched what they were doing and watched very carefully every guy that they acquired and how are they any good and where did they come from? And, mostly, are they any good? And then I started to make comparisons in my mind because that was the only way you could do it. Is Larry Grantham the Jets' best linebacker? Is he good enough to play in the NFL? I don't know. How good would Joe Namath be in the NFL? I don't know. The only guy that I felt confident about was the punter, Curly Johnson, because a punter is a punter.
Right.
He just kicked the ball. And Curly Johnson was darn good. So, that's how I related. But no, I was not a Giant fan. I've rooted for the Giants when they've been in the Super Bowl as a transplant from New York and living now in Chicago. But no, I'm not a Giant fan.
Now, in the beginning, you talk about how the Jets, who at the time were known as the Titans, were the laughing stock in the AFL. So how did the Jets kind of go about building their fan base, especially when you have a good organization in a more popular league like the NFL?
Well, even back then, it's not much different from today. The first thing is you move into a new stadium.
Mm-hmm.
The Titans and the Jets in their first year had to play in the old Polo Grounds, which was a dilapidated stadium. It was actually the Polo Grounds. It was across the river from Yankee Stadium, which separates Manhattan and the Bronx. The Yankee Stadium is on the Bronx side, and Manhattan is on the other side of the East River. To give you a little historical context, when the Yankees got Babe Ruth, they played in the Polo Grounds.
Okay.
And they outdrew fan-wise the New York Giants. And so the Giants owner said, get out of here, get yourself your own stadium. And that's why they moved literally across the river. It's like a half a mile. And the house that Ruth built literally is what happened. The Polo Grounds had been built in the early 1900s, and it had not really updated in much at all. When the New York Giants left to move to San Francisco, 5 years later, the Mets moved in, and they made some very basic modifications to it, but not really anything to speak of. And the Jets didn't really put any money, into it either, because they knew Shea Stadium was going up. It got delayed for a couple of years by a construction strike and by a really, really horrendous winter one year. But in 64, the Jets moved into the Polo Grounds, and their season ticket base went from something like 6,100 to 39,000 just by moving into a new ballpark. And you got to also remember, the New York Giants, had season ticket holders, and you couldn't get a ticket to a New York Giants game. So there were a lot of football fans who wanted to be able to go to football games. And in fact, there were a good number of New York Giant fans who bought Jets season tickets and went Saturday night when the Jets, preferred to play so they wouldn't have to compete on Sunday with the Giants for TV. And so a lot of Giants fans became at least season ticket holders to the Jets.
Yeah, and you go in your book too, talking about Sonny Werblin and how he was a big part in kind of transforming that image after Harry Wismer pretty much did everything he could to sabotage their image when they were still trying to get off the ground.
Harry Wismer was a character, and Harry Wismer was, he was an acknowledged terrific announcer in his time. Al Michaels is 80 years old. And I think there's some other, rather aging, certainly a lot of baseball announcers are getting up there. Harry Carey here in Chicago he was over 80 years old, and he was still doing the Cubs for years and years. Harry Wismer was a great promoter and showman, but he didn't have enough money. And he was trying to somehow make it to Shea Stadium being opened and built, because he felt if I can just get into that ballpark, I'll draw enough fans, no matter how bad the Titans are. And I'll be able to, to make it a go of it. And he never made it. He had 3 seasons. The team never got better than 7-7. And he was losing his shirt. Things got so bad that famously one Saturday afternoon, as it was getting darker and darker in the Polo Grounds, the referee signaled, "Turn on the lights." And Wismer went, "No." He didn't want to spend the money on the electricity.
Yeah, he wrote an autobiography, the Public Calls It Sport. Did you ever read that?
No, I should. If you have a copy of it, I'd love to read it.
Yeah, it's essentially him just pointing the finger at everyone else, but it is funny to kind of see what kind of a person he was.
There is a point to be made, but Harry Wismer didn't know anything about running a football team, and he was making a lot of football decisions.
Yeah,
and that was his second problem. But Sonny Werblin was like Wismer, a promoter and a showman, but he had money, and he had a syndicate around him of friends who also had money, and so he was willing to spend what he had to spend. In fact, he was willing to give money before Namath showed up to just about any quarterback he could find that he thought was going to be an improvement and who would get publicity. He needed to get a quarterback, as he explained, he needed to get his Babe Ruth. And he wanted a quarterback who not only could really play, which Namath could, but who he could mold into a celebrity and have running around New York City every night and having the media following him around with a starlet on his arm all the time with pictures being taken. And Namath became, a big celebrity that way. Joe Namath was the first professional football player who actually drew women to the games.
Mm.
And that's a Werblin concoction, because he played up Joe's sex appeal and charisma.
Did the American Football League have, the face of the league prior to Namath? Because it seems like when he came into the picture, he gave it a real identity. Was there a player prior to him being drafted that really kind of stuck out among American Football League fans?
No, they were Mickey Mouse League. That's not to say they didn't have some good players. They did, but no one paid much attention to them. They had a contract with ABC in 1960 through 1963 that basically had a game of the week.
Okay.
So if you had one of the 8 franchises and were a fan, you might see your team play once or twice during the year. And of course, never at home. Nobody televised any home games in those years. I mean, there were good players, but the AFL was basically a bunch of former Canadian League players and NFL players who just hadn't made the cut. George Blanda became and honed his craft at quarterback in the American Football League with Houston, and later, more famously, with the Oakland Raiders. And Len Dawson, was with Cleveland and got cut, went to the AFL, and no one really took him very seriously until he won the Super Bowl the year after the Jets won the Super Bowl. And those are 2 really great examples. Babe Parilli, who was the Jets' backup quarterback their Super Bowl year, had been drafted in 1952 by the Green Bay Packers. And he was very highly regarded, like second or third pick in the draft. And he had just bounced from team to team in the NFL, and he just wasn't good enough. And there were other, NFL rejects, you could call them, who were playing in the American Football League. And and who had a degree of success. Jackie Kemp.
Yeah.
Jackie Kemp was drafted by the New York Giants and went to San Diego in the AFL and eventually ended up with Buffalo and won back-to-back titles with the Buffalo Bills. And he was a pretty good quarterback, nothing really great to speak of. But the league got better and better. And what happened was Namath was the crown jewel because of how much money he got. He was considered in some quarters, Aron, as perhaps the greatest quarterback prospect ever to come out of college football. And that was despite the fact that he had one knee because he had gotten terribly injured his junior year at Alabama. And the Jets didn't even realize how bad the injury was until after they signed him to the contract. But what came to pass is once Namath got that kind of money, he got $427,000 for 3 years. The next year, all the other teams in the AFL, I mean, literally everybody, and started paying outlandish amounts of money to guys who just were not as important to the AFL because they didn't draw people into the stands, but they were really good players. But the year that the Jets got Namath, and I point this out in the book, they tried to sign Dick Butkus.
I didn't know that.
I didn't either. And in fact, I wrote Butkus. He just went on to Twitter a couple of weeks ago.
He's
and
tearing it up.
Yeah, and I sent him a note and I said, hey, listen, I know from my book that your buddy, Mike Tolliver, who was the Jets quarterback before Namath and who had been in Illinois with Butkus, arranged for you to meet Sonny Werblin, and Werblin offered you a contract with a blank check. And all you had to do was fill it in. You know, I'd love to have just a brief conversation about that. Now, I haven't heard back from him, and I'll probably badger him a little bit more. But, you know, when Mike Tolliver told me that story, and I said, are you S-ing me? And he said, no, I was there. I was sitting at the side of the table when Sonny pushed the contract over to Dick, and Butkus said, there's no number in here. And Werblin said, fill in the number. And this is before he signed Namath.
Before.
Imagine if the Jets in 1965 had had a rookie quarterback, Joe Namath, and a rookie middle linebacker named Dick Butkus.
They could have had multiple Super Bowls.
Well, maybe. But the thing that I also really point out is it would have changed the whole tone of the American Football League. Because if you had an animal like Dick Butkus, you know, just wrecking offenses every week and getting the publicity that he would have gotten in New York, the AFL would have put a lot more stock in building their defense, which they eventually did a year or two later. So he really could have been a difference maker. And as I pointed in the book, with or without Butkus, they also tried to sign Gale Sayers, and Kansas City wouldn't relinquish his draft rights.
Well, you know, Butkus, like you said, is on Twitter now, so maybe you can just tweet him and get a reply that way.
We will. Well, one way or another, I'll track him down.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting parts about the book when you're talking about Namath is whenever I think he was playing the Bills and he got knocked to the ground and Lou Saban goes over to talk to him, and he just wanted to tell him like how important he was to the league, and not only in terms of the image, but the financial security, the respect. It really kind of contextualized how this guy really turned the course of professional football, but also professional sports.
The word you're looking for is credibility.
Yeah.
He gave the AFL credibility because the NFL knew how important Namath was, how good Namath was. In fact, the Cardinals, who had the NFL draft rights and who were negotiating with Mike Byte, who was Joe's agent at the time, every time an offer or a counteroffer came from Mike Byte and Namath, the Cardinals owners would excuse themselves for 5 or 10 minutes, leave, and then they would come back. And they weren't, as it turned out, having private discussions themselves. They were calling the New York Giants to find out if the Giants would go along with those terms. The Giants were very secretly pretty determined to sign Namath as well. And Mike Byte, the agent, told me that Joe and he realized that and said, hey, if the New York Giants won't come out of the darkness, out of the closet and negotiate with us directly, we're never going to sign with them. And that helped push him to the Jets.
Well, and the ironic part about that, you mentioned the book, is that Weeb Ewbank didn't even want Namath in the first place, correct?
No, he did.
Oh, he did.
He pointed him out to Werblin.
Okay. Did Werblin not want him originally?
No. Werblin wanted any quarterback who could stand on 2 feet and get a headline and make himself into a star. The year before Namath's junior year at Alabama, there was a quarterback coming out of Miami, and I remember this as a kid. His name was George Myra.
Mm-hmm.
He was about 6 feet tall, and he had a gun for an arm. And Werblin was interested in signing him. Okay. And Weeb told him, no, let's wait a year. This guy Namath, and he showed him film of Namath. He said, George Myra's problem is he's not tall enough. And he said, 6-foot quarterbacks can only take you so far. You need guys 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", who can see over the offensive line and over the defensive line. And that's why, they didn't go after any other collegiate quarterbacks until Namath came along. And of course, they signed the Heisman Trophy winner, John Ewart, out of Notre Dame, the same year that they drafted Namath. Ewart was their second round pick. And Werblin famously told Sports Illustrated in training camp the next year, I don't care if it's Joe or John that becomes a superstar. I just want one of them to become our superstar quarterback.
Yeah, well, whenever you went into those chapters about Weeb Ewbank, because Weeb, as I get more and more into football history, he's a guy or a coach that I really have come to admire a lot. I mean, you mentioned Dr. Z a lot in your book, and I read the last season of Weeb Ewbank about 3 years ago.
So have I, yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredible book. But it always strikes me strange as he's underrated now and really underappreciated now, but it seems he was also that way back then. Like he never really got the same credit as Shula, who he defeated, or a Paul Brown or a Lombardi. Like, what do you think it was about Weeb that kind of just slid under the radar with people?
Weeb just didn't try to garner publicity for himself. I make a point in the book. Weeb didn't like to fine his players. He preferred that they be treated like men. And if they made a mistake, they'd be reprimanded, and he might fine him $25, and then he would give him the $25 back. He really wasn't into trying to be a taskmaster. Lombardi's reputation was built on tough and gruff, and obviously a great coach. And Tom Landry, for 4 or 5 years until the Cowboys got good, was just, he's Tom Landry. He was a great defensive coach with the New York Giants, as Lombardi was the offensive coordinator with the Giants in the 50s. Paul Brown. I mean, he's really probably, in terms of innovation and that sort of thing, and revolutionizing football, probably the greatest of all time. Now, Belichick obviously has exceeded all of them. You can't argue with success, but Weeb was unappreciated. And yet when you look that he took a Baltimore Colts franchise and a New York Jets franchise, each of which had essentially no talent at all, and built within 5 to 6 years, each of them into a championship team, that's really saying something. And I will tell you, because Weeb said it himself, he had less to work with the Jets than he did when he took over the Baltimore franchise, because they had some very young, very rough guys that they molded into really good players in Baltimore, who became, famous, like Ray Berry. And of course, he discovered Unitas. And it's really funny. He claimed he discovered Unitas from looking at still pictures of Unitas throwing the football. There was something about the way he cocked his arm and held the ball that convinced Weeb that there was something special about him.
Interesting. When you were looking at those reports or his notes that he used to write about those players, I mean, did he give you perspective on how he thought about personnel and how he thought about the game? Did that kind of give you some insights to his tricks of the trade and how he goes about developing players?
Well, I knew that Weeb emphasized intellect. Like any other football coach, you want, big, tall, strong guys.
Right.
But unlike Kansas City, the Kansas City Chiefs had this little shtick they used to do before each game, because they had guys who were 6'8" and 290 pounds and 6'9" and 295 pounds. And they would run their team out on the field, and they would start with the littlest guy. And eventually the biggest guys would show up at the end. And that was supposed to intimidate you.
Mm-hmm.
The Jets didn't have any physically intimidating guys, but they had guys who were really good football players. And Weeb used to tell his assistant coaches who did the scouting in those days to go to teams, ask the coach of the collegiate team, who's your best athlete who's also really smart? Because Weeb had, I wouldn't call them intricate offensive and defensive schemes, but he had ways of building his offense and defense that required thought process among everybody on the field. I mean, the Jets in '69 in the Super Bowl had 4 guys playing defensive back, 2 corners and 2 safeties, who either in high school and or college had played quarterback. And so they intimately knew what offenses were trying to do as well, and how to spot weaknesses in defenses and go after them.
That's interesting. I talked to Dan Fouts a few months ago, and he told me that Don Coryell was the same way, where he always wanted players that had played quarterback at some level, even if it was at high school, just to understand what the position requires and be able to understand the thought process, especially on offense, but it could also apply, especially in defensive backs.
You could have a battle of brains and wills.
Yeah, certainly.
And I think they do it today, but it was very uncommon back then. Larry Grantham, who was the Jets captain on defense, told me that the defense the Jets ran required that literally every one of the 11 guys on the field at the same time had to know what the other 10 guys were going to do on any given play. Mm-hmm. And that helped them not only to prepare, but to know that, hey, the guy next to me is a little weak in doing this, and the guy behind me is a little weak doing that. So it would help them once the play was diagnosed to make slight adaptations as to, how they're going to go about with their particular assignment. And I think that goes on a lot today, but the film back then was, I think, even more important than it is today, because the teams don't have a lot of time during the week to prepare for the next week. That's why you see, I think, somewhat better execution in Super Bowl games, because there's 2 weeks between the championship games and the Super Bowl, and that gives them a lot of time to study all angles of film and even to look at multiple games.
Well, yeah, and now you could use your phone, your iPad. It's not as a laborious process of setting up the film.
That's part of it too, but still, you have that much more time, and you have so many assistant coaches.
Right.
Rex Ryan told me that he was coaching Buffalo. He had 25 assistant coaches, and when the Jets won the Super Bowl, and this is not unusual, you had Weeby Blank, the head coach, and you had 5 assistant coaches.
Yeah, that seems like a skeleton crew compared to today.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was just much more responsibility. The Jet players told me that they think that it actually was a benefit, because it built real team camaraderie and cohesion, and you really had to stick together as a team or you were not going to succeed.
Right. Now, in terms of players on the offensive side of the ball, we recently lost Don Maynard. I think it was a couple months ago. Watching him growing up, and what about him and his playing style stood out compared to a lot of the other great receivers in the AFL?
Remember the playoff game a couple of weeks ago where Kansas City played Buffalo, and they had 13 seconds left. No, 13 before the 13 seconds, where I can't remember the guy's name, but he broke open over the middle and had a 78-yard touchdown or something.
Tyreek Hill.
I watched that, and I said to my son, that was vintage Don Maynard. And Don Maynard, he had probably more straightaway speed than anybody in pro football at that point. And he worked something out with Joe where if he was going to break a pattern, and he broke a pattern a lot because he saw that he could get open deep, he would just raise his hand and Joe would see him from 40 yards downfield, and he'd just throw the ball as far as he could throw it. Don Maynard was a real speedster. He was a track star in college. And ironically, although he was drafted by the New York Giants, he got cut by the Giants because the offensive coordinator that replaced Lombardi, his name was Ali Sherman, he went on to become the head coach of the Giants, told Maynard, you need to break your running pattern. This is football, not track. And Maynard said, no, I mean, this is how I run. This is how I get open. And Don Maynard could beat just about anybody downfield. In fact, the interesting thing about Super Bowl is that going into it, one of the expectations was that the Jets were going to fail because Namath would not be able to throw the ball deep, because the Jets would not be able to get behind the vaunted deep zone that the Baltimore Colts had. And like the 10th play on offense, Joe reared back and threw the ball, and he beat the deep zone by about 5 yards. And it completely turned around the game because the Colts went, holy, you know what? We need to double this guy, because the next time he gets open like that, Joe's going to hit him. And sure enough, later in the game, Joe did hit him, but he had a foot out of bounds in the end zone. But Don Maynard was a tremendous deep threat.
Yeah, that would have been a tremendous catch if he got that foot down. I know exactly which play you're talking about.
Yeah, he was clearly out of bounds. Some of the Jet plays, he wasn't out of bounds. He was clearly out of bounds. But yeah, and he was hurt. He became a decoy that day because he'd gotten hurt in the championship game against Oakland. And the Jets didn't know. Baltimore knew he was kind of hurt too, but they didn't know how much. And he did just enough to keep them honest. And on the right side of the Jets offense, Baltimore just double teamed him the rest of the game. And that's why George Sauer Jr. had, such a payday on the left.
Yeah, well, let's stick with Sauer for a sec, because his chapter was really interesting too. Number one, I didn't know he came from such a football background the way he did with his father. I didn't know his father was involved with the Jets. I didn't know his father was such a football presence, right, in historic terms. I had no idea about that. For the people out there who don't know, George Sauer Sr. was a star in college football in the 1930s. And, he was revered, for how good he was, back then. And his career progressed, and he became the head football coach at Navy and at Baylor. And then he came to the Titans and was their player personnel director. And he was the only guy that the Jets retained from the Titans management. And people claim it's because he still had a contract. But I've heard from people who said Werblin didn't care about that. He would have just paid him and told him to go away if there wasn't this great respect for him. And he's really the guy responsible for getting his son, to come and play in New York. George Sauer Jr. didn't even get drafted by the NFL because they was so sure that he was just going to sign with the Jets. Well, at the end of the chapter, whenever you bring up the end of Sauer's life, or when he's towards the end of his life, that there was someone that I think he worked with who was a friend that you spoke with. And he said that Sauer was always a guy who was chasing greatness, but he was always afraid of the greatness that he was chasing. Something to that effect. I mean, when you heard that, how did you make sense of that? Was that something that made you think he was more complex than anyone had known? How did you kind of interpret that? Saying?
You hit the word. It's complex. George Sauer overthought things.
Okay.
He was a guy. He was a philosopher. He was a guy who wanted to write the great American novel, and loved to write. And on the football field, he would come up with words that people would use in conversation, and he would say, hold on a second, and he would write those words down, and he wanted to incorporate them into this great book he was going to write that he never really finished. He was a real thinking man's player. I said before, he was Cooper Kupp before there was Cooper Kupp. George Sauer Jr. ran such precise routes that nobody really could cover him, and he could deke you out of your jock strap. And he had just enough speed. If he caught the ball behind you, then he'd be tough to catch. He could be caught, but he'd be tough to catch. I didn't even know who Cooper Kupp was a month ago. I'm a football fan, but you don't see the Rams play that often. So, yeah. And when I saw him, particularly last Sunday, I said, "Geez, that's George Sauer Jr." I mean, because he just turn around, he'd make this great move. He'd turn around, the ball would be there, hit him right in the numbers, and you'd wonder, how can they do that play after play? In fact, I wondered in the third quarter, when are they going to throw the ball to Cooper Kupp? I mean, I know he can get open, and they tried every other, player that they could try to get involved in the offense. And then, as we all saw, as push came to shove, they went to Kupp because that was their go-to guy. George Sauer in the Super Bowl was the Jets' go-to guy, and he just beat the Colts in their zone over and over again, short, medium, and long.
Yeah, he made a lot of tough catches. Now, whenever you started the book, you mentioned, I think when you had called the punter, that he had been waiting for someone to call him to tell his story. Did you get the sense that most of the guys had always felt a little underappreciated, given how Namath had taken the headline for that Super Bowl?
You're talking about Curly Johnson, and he had really bad CTE, even at the time that I interviewed the players. I talked to his wife, who told me everything. Okay. And that's the first thing she said to me. When I picked up the phone and called them, it was the first player I talked to. And I told her who I was, and that I was just a fan, and I wanted to write a book, the definitive book about the other guys on the team. And she covered the mouthpiece and said, "Curly, you won't believe this, but there's a guy on the phone that wants to talk to you about the Super Bowl." And I said, "I just heard you." And she said, "Oh, okay." And she said, "But Curly's been waiting 48 years for somebody to call and ask him about what happened." And Curly Johnson was a great storyteller, and he was the team prankster as well. So I'm sure a lot of the stories would have been hilarious. Luckily, his wife had written down most of them, so she passed them on to me. The impression I got from a lot of other players was the same attitude, like, "What, you want to talk to me about the Super Bowl?" Nobody else said it the way Curly Johnson's wife said it, but I think the inference was there. And yet there is a respect for Joe, and I can't really put my finger on it, but I think there's also a fear of crossing Joe by questioning anything about him. It might just come down to the real basics, which are that as much as I can want to give credit to the other 44 guys and the assistant coaches and Weeb and everybody else, let's face it, Joe was the difference maker in that game. And he was. He really was. But if the other guys didn't all play to their absolute, optimal capability, he just wouldn't have won that game. So give Joe all the credit in the world, but never forget the other guys on that team, especially because the next week after the Super Bowl was the annual American Football League All-Star game, the East against the West. And 11 other guys on that Jets team went to start for the East in that All-Star game. And, I made a point. I said to myself the other day, rather than just make the point, I got to start naming these guys. So, Jerry Philbin, the left defensive end, and John Elliott, the right tackle, and Verlin Biggs, the right end, and Larry Grantham, the linebacker, and on Matt Snell and Emerson Boozer and Maynard and Sauer and Pete Lamont, the tight end, and Jim Hudson, the strong safety. I mean, they had a team that was loaded that year. And unfortunately for them, a lot of them got hurt the year before and the year after the Super Bowl game. Well, the Jets might have won a couple of Super Bowls.
Did you have the chance to interview Namath for the book?
He wouldn't talk to me.
No?
He wanted to get paid.
Okay.
And his agent said to me, "You don't have a book without Joe." And I said, the publisher has already got a contract with me, and the publisher told me the reason they want this book and are willing to pay me is that it's the only book that's been brought to their attention that's about everybody else on the team. And that's a reality. I'm very proud of, of that fact, because really 50 years had really thrown a lot of dust and dirt on top of a lot of these guys. I mean, people today don't know who Jerry Philbin was, but Jerry Philbin was a terrific defensive end, and he was on the all AFL team that was named after, 10 years of the league's existence. And the same thing is true of Larry Grantham, who should be in the Hall of Fame, and Winston Hill, who in my forward, I expressed my desire that one of the reasons to write the book is that I wanted Winston Hill and Larry Grantham to get into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And just raising Winston's profile, just even a little bit, his daughters, came to me after he died, which was before the book came out, and said, "Hey, we appreciate everything you're doing to try to get our dad into the Hall of Fame." And they wanted to invite me to the Hall of Fame ceremony, but with the coronavirus and everything else, it was very much just a family affair.
Yeah, I definitely have paid a lot closer attention to the players you talked about, especially on defense. I mean, the offense obviously speaks for itself because they have Joe with it, but the defense, I mean, Philbin and Grantham too were intelligent players. They're also physical, which makes for a great defense.
But I'll stop you right there and say you just have to give incredible credit to the offensive line.
Yeah,
because as somebody who's watched the game,
they dominated.
You saw how Joe, except for 2 hits by Bubba Smith, Joe really was not pressured. And the Jets center, John Schmidt, said to me, we were good blockers for running plays. We were great blockers for pass plays. And they were. They protected names. I'll give you a little other insight. It's also in the book. When Babe Parilli came over from the Boston Patriots in training camp in the 68 season, Weeb Eubank took him aside and said, that 2.8 seconds that you have to get rid of the ball in Boston? And Parilli, who had been, pro football players for 15, 16, 17 years, said, yeah. And Weeb said, forget the 2.8. You got 4.2 seconds to throw the ball here.
He's in heaven.
Says a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there being that you were 16 years old when you watched this game, was there one player that you were especially excited to talk to, like that 16-year-old version of you just comes out again?
Well, my 2 favorite players were Philbin and Emerson Boozer.
Cool.
And I love talking with them. In fact, they both were among the hardest people to get to agree to talk. They both said to me, I've told my story many, many times. You can find it in the newspapers and the magazines. And I said, nope, there's something about you that I want to talk to you about that I know you have not been asked about. And in the case of Philbin, the very first sports talk telephone show in the United States was at WNBC in 1963 or 64. And the guy running the show was Bill Mazer, who became an institution in New York after that. And Bill Mazer was Jerry Philbin's godfather. He had been up in Buffalo when Philbin had been playing at the University of Buffalo, and he wouldn't stop talking about Jerry Philbin. And that's how I got interested in Jerry Philbin as a kid. And so I told Jerry, I want to talk to you about Bill Mazer. And he went, how do you know about Bill Mazer? And I said, I remember as a kid how important that relationship was with you. And Boozer didn't want to talk to me either. And I said, Emerson, I want to talk to you about how you miraculously recovered from not 1, but 2 ankle and knee injuries the year before the Super Bowl. And you got back in a year's time, ready to go and a better football player than you had been before. And he also said, okay, yeah, no one's really talked to me about that. When do you want to talk? I love talking to Matt Snell because Matt Snell doesn't talk to anybody.
Yeah.
He has a thing about the Jets, which I reveal in the book as to why he really hasn't wanted to do anything with the Jets organization. In fact, I spent more hours talking to Matt Snell than with any other player, on the team. And we built a very nice chemistry to the point where at the end, he actually said to me, I've never talked to anyone about it. Do you want to know why I don't like the Jets? And I said, tell me, but you got to tell me if I can use it in the book. And he said, let me tell you. And then you tell me, Bob, whether you want to put it in the book. And he told me that he felt he'd been slighted by the Jets organization for a coaching job or some sort of job in the organization, which Sonny Werblin had promised him he'd have a job for the rest of his life if he helped the Jets, win a championship. So Snell and I became, real good confidants. And he told me a lot of stuff, and it's revealed all over the book. A lot of these guys just told me almost without any concern at all, stuff that I don't think they would have shared with anybody.
Well, Snell wrote the foreword, one of them in the beginning of the book, right?
Yeah, people in New York were shocked. They said, "You talked to Matt Snell?" I said, "Yeah." How did you do that? And I went,
"You were just open."
Trade secret.
Now, to sort of close off the book and the conversation, I mean, you end off the book by talking about the impact that victory had on pro football, obviously, but also the entire sports industry as a whole. So to kind of put it like in a hypothetical, if Baltimore does win this game, no matter how they do it, I mean, how do you think the modern NFL really looks?
There's no American Football Conference. You have one National Football League in which the Jets are in the Giants division. Now, this might have changed over the last 50 years, but the idea was, in fact, Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner, spelled it out 2 days before Super Bowl III. He was going to absorb the 10 AFL teams, put them in the NFL. So the Jets and the Giants would have been together, and the Dallas Cowboys and Houston Oilers would have been together, and the 49ers and Raiders would have been together, and everybody else would have fitted where they belonged. So there wouldn't be an AFC and an NFC, and I don't think most people realize that at all. That would have been the single biggest change that we would not see today. And I think if you ask the average fan, if I had asked you, if I turned the tables and I was asking you questions, and I asked you before you read this book, why is there an American Football Conference? Could you have answered that question?
I could have, yeah, but I don't think most people could have answered it. My age.
I don't think most people care, but it's such an important part of the history of the NFL. And I pointed in the book, Monday Night Football happened because of Super Bowl III, because ABC decided, you know what, we got to get a piece of this NFL, game too. And so they agreed, which CBS and NBC didn't want to do, that they would put on Monday Night Football. Salaries went up. The price for the rights to telecast the games went way up. So the players made more, the teams made more, and it really set into motion the spiral of spending for pro football that continues to this day. I mean, look, Amazon, I guess it is going to be televising Thursday night football. So, I mean, where's it going to go from there? It's quite remarkable. It really is quite remarkable.
Well, and plus when you watch the game too, there's like that simple NBC letter graphic that pops up, but beyond that, it's like Kirk Dowdy in front of the stadium, just giving you a rundown of the pregame before you had all these 7 hours, 8 hour pregame shows.
It was like a 2 hour pregame show, as I recall that day. The game started at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Now it's like 3 p.m. Pacific time, or 3:30 that the game starts.
Do you remember where you watched the game?
But also the Super Bowl became a spectacle. It became part of, it didn't become, the national party celebration that it is now, but it completely set the Super Bowl up as the ultimate game. The NFL was also ready because of the absorption that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
They wanted to make sure that the AFL teams were not going to be in the Super Bowl. And they figured, again, this is before Super Bowl III. that the easiest way to do that was to take all the AFL playoff teams and NFL playoff teams and mix them together. And thereby, supposedly the NFL teams would dominate and just cream all the AFL teams. And at the end, you'd have, a Green Bay Dallas Super Bowl game, something like that. And Super Bowl III changed all that, although it took until Kansas City won the next year for the pro football world, and notably the NFL and their owners, to concede that there now was parity between the two leagues. And really, it's remarkable that the AFL came that far, not in 10 years, because historically they started in 60 and in 1970, there was, one NFL. But really the last 5 years, from the day that Namath signed his contract until, the start of the NFL with AFC and NFC, they just had done a remarkable job of signing young talent and of bringing it along and making those teams, really competitive.
Do you think that Super Bowl team Jets could have defeated the first two Packers teams that won the Super Bowl?
I'll answer it this way. I asked all the players, were you afraid going into Super Bowl III? And Don Maynard said to me, I wasn't afraid at all. Of course, my next question had to be why. And he said, well, and he had big Texas twang. The Colts weren't being coached by Vince Lombardi. They were being coached by Don Shula. Mm-hmm. If Vince Lombardi was coaching the Colts, I'd have a lot of concern.
Wow.
But Lombardi was a god.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, in retrospect, there are a lot of people who said, you know what? Kansas City and Oakland had no business being on the field with Green Bay because of Lombardi. Those Green Bay teams were winning every year.
Yeah.
Cleveland won the NFL in 64 and the Bears won the NFL in 63. But other than those years, Green Bay was winning the championship almost every year. Yeah, it was all Lombardi.
Yeah, that was well said by Maynard. All right, Bob, do you want to tell everyone where they can get the book?
Well, the book is called Beyond Broadway Joe. And I'll tell you to get it from Amazon for two reasons. First of all, good price. Mm-hmm. Secondly, read the reviews if you have any doubt at all. My favorite review is from a guy who was a Jets fan who wrote that he was flying home from Brussels back to the West Coast on a direct flight. So he had a long flight ahead of him, and he wanted to buy a book or books to read online while he was on the plane. And he saw my book online, and he ordered it, put it into his his computer, and he said, I have read every book about the New York Jets, and particularly about the Super Bowl years. And I had no expectations that I was going to really get anything out of this book. And he said, darn, that Lederer, every second or third page, he told me something I have never heard before. And that is the finest compliment that I can get from a New York Jets fan who thinks he knows it all. But it's also, I think, an important book for anyone who's interested in the history of the NFL. And in even researching the book, I had to go back to the start of the NFL and find out, where did this league really come from? What was it like? And in the early years, there was enormous instability in the NFL. They were playing teams in Muskegon and Fort Wayne, and they were, here and gone. They were there for a year or two, and then they disappear. And it wasn't until the late 40s, early 50s that they basically kind of agreed on a plan. We're only going to put teams in markets where there's a professional baseball, Major League Baseball team. And they would even name them the same names. There was a Pittsburgh Pirates football team. Yep. There was a Brooklyn Dodgers football team. There was a New York Yankees football team. And so the history of football, is really fascinating. It's not like baseball. You don't think about, the great stars of the NFL from the 20s or 30s or 40s, the way you do about Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and Walter Johnson and that sort of thing. And I think what my book really does is it gives you a tremendous look at the last great evolutionary age of pro football, which was the 60s, because the AFL succeeded where other leagues that tried to take on the NFL before the 60s and after the 60s failed. And you find it in the book Why.
Yeah, I love the scope of that, Aron, what it meant to pro football as a whole. And I love the unheralded stories that you don't hear about in pro football. So your book certainly satisfied me on both fronts. So I'm glad you took the time and answered my questions, Bob.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you read the book and that you got something out of it. And being a young whippersnapper the way you are, I'm glad that you got something and enjoyed it, because it was 3 years of my life to write that book. And as my wife said to me, you're having way too much fun, as I was talking to these guys. And they were just so giving in their willingness to tell me stuff. It's funny. I was told that Namath wouldn't talk to me because he'd want to get paid. That was true. I was told that Don Maynard wouldn't talk to me because he wanted to get paid. And Don Maynard was really cheap. He didn't ask me for a dime, and he gave me whatever time I wanted to ask whatever questions I wanted, and he gave me honest, forthright answers. Very few people, with one exception, when I asked about Curly Johnson and all the pranks that he played on some of his teammates, people kind of shut up. But other than that, I heard about everything else that was going on, and there's just great insight as to what makes a team work. And I'll say this last thing: you could write a book about any Super Bowl champion similar to this book, in that take away the star quarterback or the star wide receiver, or in the Rams case, Aaron Donald. Who are these other guys on the field that had to perform? The 45th player on the Jets was the backup defensive lineman who basically played only on special teams. And he told me that he just didn't feel like he was part of the team because he wasn't somebody that anybody paid attention to. And I told him, and I meant it, you ran down the field on special teams and either got blocked or made tackles. And there's no one out there that can say that you would have done it exactly the same thing that you were able to accomplish. So whatever you did that year, you were part of a Super Bowl champion and of that team that pulled the greatest upset, in Super Bowl history. And, never back away from that. That should be something you're proud of.
Well, and to that point too, I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the same player, but he was a linebacker in college who became a defensive tackle for the Jets, and he was injured and felt that he never really reached his full potential.
You're talking about Carl McAdams. I'm not talking about him.
Okay, but his story was interesting too, and how you brought that to light.
Fascinating, because he was going to be the next, not Butkus, but Tommy Nobis became a big NFL star.
Yeah,
and Carl McAdams was considered right up there, 1 and 1A, and Tommy Nobis, I think, was the first pick in the draft.
Mm-hmm.
Carl McAdams was signed by the Jets the year after Namath, and if he hadn't hurt himself in the college all-star game that they used to play before the season started, he might have had an unbelievable career, because the Jet linebackers, to a man, said to me they watched him in practice before he went to the all-star game, and they looked at each other and they said, one of us is going to be out of a job. This guy is everywhere. He's all over the field, incredible speed and tackling ability like you can't believe. And he came back, couldn't play linebacker anymore. He was that badly injured.
Yeah.
But they made him a 225-pound defensive tackle who in spots could really make a play. In fact, on the famous flea flicker that the Colts pulled at the very end of the first half of Super Bowl III, Carl McAdams almost broke the play up. And you can't see it except if you look on the official game film that the league provides to each of the two teams every week. And I have that film, and I could slow things down. And he had his hand around Tom Maddie's ankles And I don't know how Tom Matte broke that tackle before he flipped the ball back to Morrow, but Carl McAdams just about had him. And that in itself would have been an amazing play.
Yeah, especially given his story. Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's stories like that you bring to life. And I think that's what makes a writer succeed. So I think you did a great job writing this book, Bob.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's very nice to hear that from any football fan, but anybody who's going to take the time to talk to me as you've had today. I'm very much in your debt.
Thank you, Bob. Have a good one.
You too.